Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch, two of Magic's most hated sets. But why are they regarded this way? Well, I'm going to explore these sets through their cards, flavor, and mechanics to try and figure this out. But first, if you haven't seen my last video, or aren't familiar with the original Zendikar sets, I made a video all about original Zendikar block that you can watch to catch up. Now, Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch take place about 2 years after the release of the Eldrazi. What we return to is a world deep in the folds of survival and slaughter. After Rise of the Eldrazi, Gideon left to go get help from other planeswalkers. Sadly, he gets turned down by others and only returns with Jace, leaving it to them, Nissa, and the people of Zendikar to stop the Eldrazi from destroying the plane. Okay, so this sounds like more of the sort of thing that was happening in Rise of the Eldrazi. Because it really is. Battle for Zendikar continues the story of warlike struggle between Zendikari and Eldrazi. It focuses on specific battles and delves into part of the history of how the Eldrazi were first contained on Zendikar. From a design perspective, this set has changed a lot. The first thing that stands out when looking at the entire set is that the number of Eldrazi has increased dramatically. Bro had a total of 19 cards with the typeline Eldrazi, of those only 15 being creatures. Comparatively, Battle for Zendikar has a total of 51 Eldrazi creatures, and these two sets were about the same size, so proportionally it's a major increase, and this is going to cause the set's first major problem. In his Drive to Work podcast, head designer Mark Rosewater explains in simple terms what makes the identity of the Eldrazi.
Mechanically speaking, here's another problem. So the Eldrazi are giant hungry alien monster things, and so in order to make them work, you have to make them huge, which is not easy to do. You have to find some way to get the sense of hunger, which is really hard, and they need the sense of colorlessness that, at least it's the one defining traits for them, but it makes it tricky.
So you're creating a roughly 300 card set where about 1 in 6 cards are Eldrazi. How do you satisfy these stipulations of them being huge, colorless, and hungry? Well, pretty much every single one of these presented a problem. There really isn't a solution to the problem of size here. You can't have them all be big or limited is going to suffer, as your curves are going to be completely out of whack. So in the end, this design point is essentially ignored. The Eldrazi are just smaller than they used to be. Now, in the same vein, how do you keep them colorless while maintaining your set's integrity? Well, to try and prevent homogenization, both of the Eldrazi and the entire set, they had to do something new or risk breaking another pillar. The solution to this problem is the creation of Devoid. Devoid is a keyword that simply states the card has no color. Normally a card's color is determined by its mana cost, but with Devoid, the card can have any colors in its casting cost and still be considered colorless. Now, Devoid is a good solution to this problem. This way the Eldrazi are still technically colorless, and with the new frame, I think they still retain some of that otherworldliness that was previously present. The mechanic isn't often that relevant, and I found it's mostly forgotten until issues of protection come up. Devoid can offer monocolored decks potential ways to get around protection, and that counts for something. The third and final design pillar of the Eldrazi is their hunger. Previously we saw this represented in the mechanic of Annihilator. Now, Annihilator wasn't going to come back. The lowest the mechanic has been on the Storm scale is a 7, and while it is a cool mechanic, it has a problem that it snowballs, meaning each time you attack with Annihilator, you make it harder and harder for your opponent to recover, snowballing the problem as you make them sacrifice more and more of their permanents. So, to represent Eldrazi hunger in Battle for Zendikar, the ingest mechanic was made. Ingest functions in a space I'd consider adjacent to milling. When a creature with ingest deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top card of their library. So comparatively, this is better against graveyard decks than milling, but you definitely are not going to kill a lot of opponents by ingesting their deck. Understandably, they played it a little bit safe, not wanting to overpower it and have entire decks getting exiled, but I think they could have been a little bit riskier, with different levels of ingest equal to how many cards the player has to exile. Now the other reason that ingest is weaker is that it's part of an A and B design. This sort of design is where you need 2 different subsets to make a mechanic fully work. In this case, the A is an ingester, and the B, or the payoff, is a processor card. Processor cards have a payoff, where if you put a card an opponent controls in exile into their graveyard, you get an additional effect. So for processors to work effectively, you must first ingest cards from their library. then play your processor. This combination of mechanics is super flavorful. It's a great representation of the Eldrazi taking the resources from Zendikar, repurposing them for their own, using up their value. Sadly, in execution, the mechanics are not that great to play with. Mostly the problem lies in the fact that neither are that individually powerful, and collectively, they still often don't amaze. Most of the processors just don't do that much when you process something, and do nothing if you can't. Compare a card like Mindraker to Burglar Rats, or even to something like Cackling Fiend. Sure, Mindraker has better stats and is slightly easier to cast, but this card from Urza's Saga is guaranteed to have the discard effect. Most of the processors are like this. They're not astoundingly bad by any means, but they're about the same amount of payoff we've come to expect, and they're almost unplayable if you can't process something when they come into play. So, representation of Eldrazi here is mixed. The new Ulamog and Void Winnower hold the same cool power of the classic Eldrazi, and the art overall is pretty great. While it lacks that colossal imposing feeling of Rise of the Eldrazi, there are some really cool and still creepy designs that move it into this new, strange horde place. In returning non-Eldrazi mechanics, we see landfall and ally mechanics coming back. Allies now featuring the ability word Rally. Many have complained about landfall being weaker in its return, to which I'd say, yep, it is weaker. But overall, this set is a bit underpowered, so I'm not particularly surprised that this element is underpowered too. Allies suffer the same powering down, and Rally is really just adding an ability word to something that never really needed it.
Rally is the ally theme for the set.
This is a useless keyword. This one I don't understand.
But it's still nice to see the tribe getting some more love. When I was doing my research on what other people thought about Battle for Zendikar, I came across this article by now world champion Paulo Vitor Dama de Rosa, where he wrote about a complaint of his for allies, being that you can't tell the difference between what is and isn't an ally, and that it seems very arbitrary about who decides they're allied with Zendikar. And I half agree. As far as visual design goes, this is a complaint against allies in general, and not Battle for Zendikar. There's never really been a way to tell in the original set who was and wasn't an ally by just looking at the image. But in the original Zendikar, all of the allies, aside from Stone Puma, did something when they entered the battlefield, so you could at least tell that way. Battle for Zendikar did do something good with allies, however. The original Zendikar sets were monocolored, but Battle for Zendikar features color pairs, and these can be seen on creatures such as Eldrazi's or Elementals. But allies are the only humanoid creatures that are represented on multicolored cards. This is flavorful. Allies are working together, going across their normal borders, bringing in new colors to help fight for Zendikar, making these cards flavorful and easily identifiable. Awaken is boring. It can give cards an extra use in the late game, similar to Kicker, which is good, but it lacks the variety and interest of Kicker. Most of the design is just a card we've already seen, but with Awaken. I will say flavor-wise it fits pretty well with the set, having the lands animating to fight back against the Eldrazi swarm. Beyond that though, I just don't have much to say about it. The final mechanic of the set I do have a lot to say about though. Converge I find to be a super interesting mechanic, despite not always being the best executed. Converge is a mechanic that specifically cares about how many different colors of mana you use to cast the spell, similar to Sunburst. Essentially, there is an array of what effect you will get from the card with Converge. Let's say you cast Brilliant Spectrum using only blue mana. You will get to draw one card, and then have to discard two. That's pretty bad. But the more colors of mana you use to cast the spell, the better it gets. The ceiling on a Converge card is of course the mana cost. If you're casting something for CMC 3, the most you're going to get from that effect is 3. With Converge, I think the mechanic suffers most from pretty bad cards containing the mechanic. Look at Painful Truths. At best, you have to pay 3 different colors of mana to draw 3 cards and lose 3 life. That's pretty bad. And at worst, you're only going to get to draw 1 card for 3 mana. On the other hand, you have a card like Woodland Wanderer, which at worst is a 3/3 with Vigilance and Trample for 4. But at best, it could be a 6/6 with Vigilance and Trample for 4. Albeit, you need 4 different colors to cast it, which is not easy. but it's still an interesting variation that can be a very rewarding payoff for trying to run a more complicated mana base, and isn't totally useless if you can't get there. Bring to Light is another good example of Converge, where there is a great variance in how good of a payoff you can get, but still having value at the base casting cost. In fact, this card is even seeing play in Pioneer right now, where people are using it to its fullest capability with Niv Mizzet Reborn. So those are the mechanics of Battle for Zendikar. They're not all bad, but they certainly are powered down. This lower power level I often hear as a complaint about the set, and I get it. It sucks to play with less powerful cards, and it's hard to return to a plane that was incredibly powerful and see it nerfed. But the game can't always be one-upping the last set, or you're going to end up with power creeping so fast that you destroy competitive play and people's motivation to keep playing. That's not to say Battle for Zendikar didn't mess up though. The introduction of battle lands into a standard that had fetches made mana bases a bit too good, and 4 and 5 color decks started popping up. Additionally, a lot of players considered green unplayable in Limited due to it just not being very well balanced. Here's someone else commenting on the Limited situation who definitely knows it better than me.
Part of it is that, well, first of all, it doesn't have good commons. I mean, when you look at commons, that's going to drive a lot of the power of any particular color. That's a big part of it. Another is that it's got a lot of unthemed cards. You know, Broodhunter Worm and Lifespring Druid, and even good ones, like the Druid is good. They don't have a lot of really strong synergies. Green ends up with, I think, not enough power or synergy, and you want either one or the other, and just green just has neither. I'm not going to say the green's unplayable. I drafted green in my first draft and was happy with it. It's more that green is just worse than all the other colors.
Previously, I mentioned that the original Zendikar booster boxes held rare treasures of old, powerful cards that could randomly be found in packs. In a fantastic move, Wizards tried to capture this feeling again, but instead of simply doing the same thing, they designed a whole new type of card to discover. BAM! Expeditions. These blinged out boss cards are reprints of some of the best lands across Magic's history. The frame design is excellent at giving extra space to see these beautiful new Zendikar specific arts. Expeditions were awesome, and really brought a new excitement to opening both Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch boosters. I think they're super awesome, but also I think they really show how different this trip to Zendikar is from the last. The powerful treasure of original Zendikar made sense within the set, because it was all about treasure hunting and adventure. This time, Zendikar is about a horrible war. Sure, some of these lands fit with this in the interesting Eldrazi altered landscape, but the spirit of treasure hunting and adventure that was found in the original Zendikar is completely gone in these sets. On the topic of new lands, we have a new basic land type, but these don't produce purple mana. These make colorless mana, a mana type that has actually existed since forever in Magic. In alpha cards like Mana Vault and Sol Ring, they produced colorless mana. To clarify, colorless and generic mana are different things. Generic is used to describe a cost, which can be paid by any color or by colorless mana. Colorless mana is the mana you produce that does not have a color. There just wasn't a symbol for it until Oath of the Gatewatch. But wait, you may be thinking, in the last set, full of colorless Eldrazi, we saw things like this, which are now changed to this. Well, mechanically, these are the exact same thing. In an article written by Sam Stoddard, he writes that changing colorless for Battle for Zendikar was difficult but not impossible, and that they decided to save it for Oath so that it would be more exciting and new for the set. It seems that the choice of changing to colorless was made fairly last minute and that there was a lot of back and forth involved. And sure, it is more exciting, but it's sloppy form. Imagine you're a new player and you have cards from both of these sets. There's no way a new player is going to look at a Kozilek's Channeler and realize that they can cast a Deceiver of Form using the colorless that this card makes, because they've been taught that you need to use this, which is a symbol not represented on this card. It's confusing, and it could have been avoided, which is a shame. But years later, it's not really a problem. We have yet to see things that cost specifically colorless again, and the colorless symbol is a positive for the game, as it clarifies something that's always been true. Cohort is another new ability for allies that requires you to tap the creature and another ally you control to activate it. When the payoffs are good, this ability is okay, but tapping 2 creatures for an ability that usually only requires 1 is just unplayable in most cases. I mean, at least ally fans were given a general for their commander decks in this set, which is good. Another new mechanic is support, where you may put a +1/+1 counter on a number of creatures equal to the support number. This is a good go-wide mechanic where you can strengthen your team up so that creatures can continue to be viable as the game progresses. It would seem a little bit shallow, but this mechanic gets extra depth as cards reward you for supporting or are additionally strengthened from the support. During Oath of the Gatewatch pre-releases, there was an emphasis on Two-Headed Giant. The reason it was emphasized was because of this mechanic, Surge. Surge is an alternate, cheaper casting cost that you may pay if you or a teammate has already cast a spell this turn. Some Surge cards also have an additional effect that will happen if their Surge cost was paid. As someone whose favorite pre-release format is 2HG, I find this mechanic super cool, and I'm sad I didn't get to play with it. But I think that it's an intelligent design, and the fact that they made it functional both for this format and for single player is a good move. Surge seems to have inspired the assist mechanic from Battlebond, which will most likely mean we never see Surge again, as assist just functions better in Commander, where anyone can choose to help, and you don't need to have a teammate. So that's it for the new mechanics, and I suppose I should address the story of Oath of the Gatewatch. But honestly, I've been avoiding it because I have a hard time sorting my thoughts and feelings about the story. I don't like the Gatewatch. I like the Planeswalkers in the background. That's just my preference though. I think it also doesn't help that the Gatewatch's story seems kind of anticlimactic. I mean, the Eldrazi Titans are supposed to be these absurdly powerful beings. In order to seal them away, it took 3 Old Walkers, who were essentially gods at the time. But now we have a couple of new Walkers who realized the solution was just to burn them. It feels unearned. If you do like the Gatewatch, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong for enjoying them. I just personally don't enjoy the direction they take the story in. Additionally, the specific direction that the Zendikar story went in is also flawed, and this is even admitted by Mark Rosewater.
That is the first big mistake. The first big mistake is I should have just realized, well, part of it was the Eldrazi was not the most exciting thing about the environment. So committing so much to the Eldrazi was a problem. Imagine if the story was about a quest, but our heroes had to go on a quest because half the planet had been taken over by Eldrazi, but we're not focused on the half taken over by Eldrazi, we're focused on the half that's not, and they're going on a quest of sort of old school Zendikar to find some magical item that's going to save the day. Because like a quest, that's an adventure story. Now, now we can sort of tell, and that like, maybe there's pieces of them going through Eldrazi territories. It's something where we get to see a little bit of the Eldrazi, but not that the focus is all about, oh my gosh, giant war against the Eldrazi.
In retrospect, this alternate proposal would have solved a lot of issues within these two sets, at least as far as the Eldrazi are concerned. Instead, you can focus more on the questing and conflicts of the original Zendikar sets, but with the additional threat of the Eldrazi. Since they're not the main focus, you don't need 1 in 6 of your set to be an Eldrazi, and they can stay big. They can stay colorless and they can stay hungry, and that won't affect the set nearly as much, because there would just be less of them. And while the Eldrazi are super cool in design, they aren't the most interesting villains, and I'll admit that I probably would have made the same mistake in designing this set. In hearing how I previously talked about Rise of the Eldrazi, I rave about how incredible their design is, and how interesting the ramp up to the war was. But really, it functions as a better climax than a full story, and the more that you dwell with it, the less interesting it gets. So yeah, that's Oath of the Gatewatch. Yep, that's it. Nothing else to talk about. Except for the fact that this set ruined Modern for a while. Before the summer of GAC, we had Eldrazi Winter, a time in which Eldrazi decks quickly became the definitive best decks of Modern, all thanks to cards printed back in the original Zendikar sets. Now, when Rise of the Eldrazi was printed, Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple weren't that crazy, because, well, these were small Eldrazi's at the time. And Battle for Zendikar had smaller Eldrazi, but they all had color in them. Then, Oath of the Gatewatch printed these cards. Suddenly, a card like Eldrazi Mimic costs, well, no, it costs nothing. You can cast it for free. Theoretically, turn 1, you could play your Eye of Ugin and then drop, say, 3 Eldrazi Mimics. Then turn 2, you could play an Eldrazi Temple and exile a Simian Spirit Guide. Now that you have 5 mana, what Eldrazi do you cast? Well, you play this, Reality Smasher, and suddenly you can swing in for 20 damage on turn 2. Of course, this requires the perfect 7 cards, but it paints the picture. Eye of Ugin became totally busted in this environment, because it wasn't just a land that tapped for 2 like Temple, but instead could be used for 2 or 6 or even more mana in a single turn. Having access to both of these lands and other powerful creatures was too much. Other powerful cards included Reality Shaper and Thought-Knot Seer, which helped to give you more consistency and slow your opponent down, while also being incredibly aggressively costed when you could cast them 2 turns early. But there was some diversity within the meta, mostly being other Eldrazi decks. There was a blue-red variant and a blue-white variant. Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch's top 8 was dominated by Eldrazi decks, with only 2 other decks being present, that being Affinity, rest in peace. After the Pro Tour, other tournaments found similar results. The Star City Games Open in Louisville had its 2-day meta share being almost 50% Eldrazi decks. Then 3 Modern Grand Prix happened simultaneously, and on average their top 100s were 43% Eldrazi decks. It was, of course, a super unhealthy meta. There's a lot of other things surrounding the rise of Eldrazi Winter, such as the banning of Splinter Twin and Summer Bloom, but frankly, I'm not the best person to tell this story, and hopefully someday there will be a pretty decent delving into the topic. Thankfully, Wizards finally banned Eye of Ugin, and Modern would never have any major problems again. So ultimately, how do I feel about these sets? Are they truly the worst sets in Magic history? Well, that's hard to really define. What these sets are is flawed at their core. There were a lot of changes in the design of these sets, largely resulting from the switch from 3 set blocks to 2 set blocks, and the mishandling of how to return to this conflict didn't help either. So yeah, they're pretty bad, but there's still plenty of good things to appreciate within these sets. The designs of the Distortion and Blight of the 2 Eldrazi Titans are pretty interesting, and while it looks kinda dumb on some cards, there's plenty of really cool cards that showcase how the land of Zendikar is being distorted and destroyed by the Eldrazi presence. With the creation of Pioneer, we've seen some cards from the block finding new homes in decks, showing that the set is not completely powered down. Additionally, I think that this set is great for Commander. More printings of full arts are always fantastic. Wastes give colorless commanders much more manageable mana bases, not to mention all the other cool new colorless cards to add to those decks. These 2 sets also had awesome new commanders. Kozilek the Great Distortion is, to me, the coolest colorless commander, with a really surprisingly swingy control gameplay. Aili had previously been quoted on flavor text, now seeing printing on a really fun card, which was a recurring thing. Other legendaries previously quoted in flavor text now getting their own cards, helping flesh out the world of Zendikar. Other cards that may not be deck defining or game breaking are just great additions to play with. So that's my take on it. They're just, flawed Magic sets. I don't think you have to hate them. But hopefully now, from the mistakes of these 2 sets, when we return to Zendikar for the 3rd time, the design team will have learned from these mistakes and we'll get back to that exciting thrill of the original Zendikar sets. But of course, that's just my take on it. You are welcome to feel however you want. You can completely hate the sets, you can completely love them, you are entitled to your own opinion. Feel free to talk about anything that I missed. This video is kind of long, and there's a lot of things that I maybe didn't get to that I wanted to, or that I might have just outright forgotten. So thank you so much, everyone who waited for this video. I'm sorry that it took so long, but everyone leaving comments, I've been reading them as I make this video, and I am just so appreciative of all the support people have given me, and it really motivates me to keep making these videos. So thank you so much. I'm not sure what video will be next, but I'm sure it will be fun to make.